Imagine waking up one morning and knowing, without doubt, that you are already dead. Your heart beats, your lungs breathe, yet your mind whispers something far more terrifying. This body is a lie. In the shadowy corridors of psychiatry exists a condition so disturbing it erases the boundary between life and death, a disorder, where people believe their organs have rotted, their blood has vanished, their soul has already crossed over. Tonight on The Dark Tales, we descend into the abyss of the human mind. This is walking corpse syndrome, the most disturbing psychiatric case ever recorded. In the late 19th century, psychiatry was still a dimly lit room filled with guesswork, fear, and crude theories about the human mind. Mental illness was not yet mapped with scans or chemical formulas, but observed through suffering bodies and fractured speech. Doctors relied on case notes, intuition, and long hours watching patients unravel. It was in this fragile era of medicine that a disorder emerged which did not merely distort reality, but erased it altogether, forcing science to confront a horrifying possibility that the mind could deny its own existence. In 1880, French neurologist Jules Cotard encountered patients whose beliefs shattered every known category of madness. These individuals were not claiming to be kings or prophets or hunted by unseen enemies. Instead, they insisted on something far more unsettling. They believed they were dead. Some said their organs had vanished. Others claimed their blood had dried up or their brains had turned to dust. A few believed their bodies were slowly decomposing while still moving. Cotard was confronted with people who did not fear death, because in their minds, death had already occurred. Cotard described this phenomenon as a delusion of negation, a mental state in which the self, the body, and the world were systematically denied. Patients rejected the existence of their own flesh, their emotions, even time itself. They did not simply feel empty or hopeless. They believed nothing remained. Identity dissolved, memory lost meaning. Life became an illusion playing out after its ending. For doctors accustomed to treating hysteria and melancholy, this condition felt like staring into a void, with no medical language to describe it. One of the most disturbing aspects of these early cases was their calm logic. Patients argued their condition with chilling clarity. If they were dead, they reasoned, then eating was unnecessary. If their organs no longer existed, pain could not be real. If the world itself was unreal, then consequences had no weight. Cotard realized that this was not confusion but conviction. These beliefs were not fleeting thoughts but rigid structures that governed every action, making the disorder profoundly dangerous. At the time, death was a familiar presence in society, but believing oneself to be dead while walking, speaking, and breathing was beyond comprehension. Medical journals spread the reports across Europe, where other physicians began recognizing similar cases hidden within asylums. What emerged was the terrifying realization that this syndrome was not rare imagination, but a genuine psychiatric phenomenon capable of leading patients towards starvation, neglect, and self-destruction without resistance. Cotard's work marked a turning point in psychiatric history because it challenged the assumption that madness always added false ideas to the mind. Here was an illness that subtracted reality itself. The patient did not see monsters or conspiracies. The patient saw nothing. No self, no life, no future. This absence became the core of their existence, creating a living paradox that medicine struggled to contain. As these cases accumulated, Cotard's delusion became one of the earliest examples, showing that the brain could dismantle the concept of being alive. It suggested that consciousness was not guaranteed by a beating heart, but maintained by fragile neural agreements that could break. Long before modern neuroscience confirmed it, this disorder exposed the terrifying truth that existence itself could be mentally revoked, leaving behind a body that moved forward, while the mind had already crossed into nothingness. At the center of walking corpse syndrome lies a belief so absolute that it overrides every instinct for survival. The individual does not feel as though they are dying, nor do they fear death as something approaching. Instead, they are convinced that death has already claimed them. This belief does not arrive suddenly like a hallucination, but grows slowly, tightening its grip until it becomes the only truth the mind will accept. To the sufferer, their continued movement through the world feels like an error, a delay, or a cruel aftereffect of something that should have already ended. Those affected often describe a complete collapse of bodily reality. They claim their heart no longer beats, their lungs no longer draw air, or their blood has stopped flowing entirely. Some believe their internal organs have been removed or have decayed into nothing. Others insist their body is hollow, empty, or slowly rotting from within. These sensations are not imagined in the way dreams are imagined. They are experienced with absolute certainty. Mirrors become meaningless, medical tests are dismissed, and physical sensations are reinterpreted as proof that life has ceased. What makes this belief especially disturbing is its internal logic. The mind constructs a system where every contradiction becomes further confirmation. If the person feels pain, they may conclude it is a phantom sensation, leftover nerves firing after death. If they feel hunger, they believe it is a mechanical reflex with no purpose. If they survive an injury, it proves not that they are alive, but that they cannot die again. Each piece of evidence meant to ground them in reality instead deepens the delusion, sealing them further inside their mental grave. Emotionally, many patients experience a chilling numbness that reinforces the belief. Joy disappears, fear fades, and even sadness becomes distant. Without emotional response, life feels artificial and hollow. This absence of feeling convinces the mind that something essential has already vanished. The self no longer reacts because the self no longer exists. In this state, the world feels flat and distant, like scenery viewed by someone who does not belong within it. As the belief strengthens, behavior begins to change in unsettling ways. Some individuals stop eating or drinking because corpses do not require nourishment. Others neglect hygiene, convinced decay makes cleanliness irrelevant. A few withdraw completely, lying motionless for hours or days, waiting for a burial that never comes. There are cases where sufferers wander into cemeteries, feeling drawn to where they believe they belong, convinced they are misplaced among the living. In extreme forms of the syndrome, the belief evolves into a sense of cursed immortality. The person concludes that because they are already dead, they are trapped in an endless state of existence without release. This idea can become unbearable, leading to self-harm or suicide attempts not driven by despair, but by the desire to prove the belief true or escape a condition they see as worse than death itself. Survival does not bring relief. It becomes confirmation that normal rules no longer apply. This unwavering conviction is what separates walking corpse syndrome from other psychiatric disorders. The belief is not symbolic, exaggerated, or metaphorical. It is literal, structured, and unmovable. Reason, reassurance, and physical evidence fail because the mind has already rewritten the definition of life. Once that line is crossed, the individual does not feel like someone who is sick. They feel like someone who no longer exists, moving through a world that has already left them behind. The first documented case that brought walking corpse syndrome into medical history was not dramatic in appearance, but devastating in consequence. The patient, later referred to in medical literature as Mademoiselle X, appeared outwardly calm and coherent, speaking in measured sentences that gave no immediate impression of madness. Yet beneath this surface was a belief so absolute that it would quietly lead her toward death. She insisted that her body no longer contained organs and that her physical form was nothing more than an empty shell moving through the world. According to reports, she believed she had no brain, no nerves, no chest, and no internal structure capable of sustaining life. Because of this, she reasoned that biological needs no longer applied to her. Hunger was dismissed as meaningless. Pain was interpreted as a residual echo from a body that no longer existed. Her statements were not emotional pleas or confused ramblings. They were delivered with cold certainty, as if she were explaining a simple fact rather than announcing her own death. This belief carried a horrifying logic that made it nearly impossible for doctors to intervene. If she was already dead, she argued, then eating served no purpose. Nourishment was designed for the living, and she no longer belonged to that category. Physicians attempted to persuade her with reason, presenting physical examinations and urging her to eat. Each attempt failed because it required her to accept a reality her mind had already erased. The more they tried to convince her she was alive, the more firmly she rejected their efforts. As days passed, her refusal to eat became absolute. She did not protest or show distress. There was no panic, no struggle, no visible despair. She simply declined food as one would decline an unnecessary object. This calm detachment disturbed doctors far more than violent behavior would have. It revealed that belief alone could override the most basic instinct for survival without resistance. Eventually, her body began to weaken. Weight dropped, strength faded, and organs that she believed did not exist started to fail. Even then, the belief did not waver. Physical deterioration was not seen as evidence of life, but as further proof that her body was decomposing as expected. Starvation became, in her mind, a natural process rather than a fatal one. Her death forced the medical community to confront a terrifying realization. This was not a symbolic belief or poetic despair. It was a delusion capable of producing real, irreversible consequences. The mind had issued a verdict, and the body obeyed. The case demonstrated that psychiatric conditions could be just as lethal as physical diseases, not through direct injury, but through absolute conviction. After her death, similar cases began surfacing across Europe, hidden within asylums and hospitals. Doctors recognized the same pattern of calm denial, logical reasoning, and fatal outcomes. Mademoiselle X became the silent foundation of what would later be understood as Cotard's delusion, a condition where belief does not merely distort reality, but replaces it entirely, revealing how fragile the line between existence and nothingness truly is. As walking corpse syndrome takes hold, life begins to unravel in ways that feel both subtle and deeply disturbing. The earliest changes are often internal, marked by a creeping sense of disconnection from the body and the world. Patients describe feeling distant from their own thoughts, as if their mind is observing existence rather than participating in it. Familiar sensations lose meaning, and emotions fade until they feel artificial or entirely absent. This growing emptiness becomes the foundation upon which the belief of being dead begins to settle. One of the most prominent features of the syndrome is depersonalization. The individual no longer recognizes themselves as a living entity, but as an object or a remnant. Looking at their hands or face can feel like staring at someone else's remains. The body becomes a shell that moves out of habit rather than purpose. This detachment is not fleeting. It persists, eroding the sense of self until identity feels irrelevant. Without a sense of self, the idea of life loses its anchor. Alongside this detachment comes an overwhelming nihilism. The world appears drained of meaning, stripped of cause and effect. Time feels distorted, either frozen or endlessly repetitive. Past experiences seem disconnected, as though they belong to another person who has already ceased to exist. The future becomes unthinkable because it requires a living subject. This mental landscape reinforces the belief that life has already ended, and that what remains is merely a continuation without purpose. Behavioral changes soon follow these internal shifts. Many patients stop engaging in basic self-care, bathing, grooming, and maintaining cleanliness feel pointless because decay is assumed to be inevitable. Some neglect their surroundings entirely, allowing living spaces to fall into disarray that mirrors their internal collapse. These behaviors are not acts of rebellion or despair, but logical extensions of their belief system. If one is already dead, preservation no longer matters. Eating habits are often among the most alarming symptoms. Food is rejected not because of appetite loss alone, but because nourishment is believed to be unnecessary. Hunger may be acknowledged, but it is interpreted as a mechanical signal without meaning. In severe cases, patients completely stop eating, convinced that sustenance is irrelevant to a body that no longer functions. This refusal can lead to rapid physical decline, even as the patient remains emotionally detached from the consequences. Some individuals develop an eerie relationship with places associated with death. Cemeteries, morgues, or abandoned spaces exert a strange pull, as if they represent a rightful destination. Patients may wander these areas, convinced they belong among the dead rather than the living. This behavior further isolates them from society, deepening the divide between their internal reality and the world around them. Physical sensations themselves become distorted. Pain may be dismissed as imaginary, while injuries are ignored or left untreated. Illness is seen not as a threat but as confirmation of decay. Even severe symptoms fail to provoke fear, because fear requires a belief in survival. In this state, the body continues to deteriorate while the mind remains unmoved, convinced that what is happening is simply the natural process of something that has already ended. Together, these symptoms create a nightmare in which the individual drifts further away from life while still occupying it. The syndrome transforms ordinary human functions into meaningless rituals, stripping away instinct, emotion, and connection until the person becomes a living contradiction, moving through the world as if already buried. As researchers began to study walking corpse syndrome more closely, A disturbing pattern emerged linking the condition to severe disruptions in both emotional processing and brain function. Many patients diagnosed with the syndrome were already suffering from profound depression, often of a melancholic or psychotic nature. This was not ordinary sadness, but a state so deep that the individual's sense of worth, identity, and existence had already begun to collapse. In this mental landscape, the idea of being dead did not feel metaphorical. It felt accurate. Severe depression strips life of emotional color, draining pleasure, motivation, and attachment from the world. For some individuals, this emotional void becomes so complete that it no longer feels like suffering but like absence. When feelings disappear, the mind searches for an explanation. Walking corpse syndrome appears when the brain concludes that emotional numbness means life itself has ended. If nothing is felt, then nothing must remain. The belief of death becomes the most logical explanation for an internal emptiness that feels absolute. Beyond depression, the syndrome has been repeatedly linked to neurological damage. Brain imaging studies in later years revealed abnormalities in regions responsible for self-awareness, emotional integration, and reality testing. Damage to the frontal and parietal lobes, often caused by strokes, tumors, infections, or traumatic brain injuries, can disrupt the brain's ability to connect perception with emotional meaning. The individual may recognize their body visually, yet feel no emotional ownership over it. This disconnect creates the terrifying sensation that the body exists without a self. In some cases, patients developed walking corpse syndrome following severe illnesses or neurological events that altered consciousness. After recovering physically, their minds failed to reintegrate the experience of being alive. The body survived, but the sense of existence did not return with it. This suggests that the syndrome is not purely psychological, but a breakdown in the brain's internal communication systems, where recognition and belief fall dangerously out of alignment. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have also been associated with the condition, particularly during psychotic episodes. In these states, reality testing becomes unstable, allowing delusions to form and harden. What makes walking corpse syndrome unique is that the delusion is not grandiose or external. It is inward, erasing the self rather than inflating it. Instead of believing they are powerful or chosen, patients believe they are already gone. Researchers have proposed that the syndrome arises from a failure in emotional feedback loops. Normally, when a person sees themselves, moves their body, or experiences sensations, the brain generates emotional confirmation of being alive. In walking corpse syndrome, this confirmation is missing. The brain perceives movement without meaning, sensation without ownership, existence without presence. Faced with this contradiction, the mind resolves it by declaring death. This understanding explains why reassurance alone rarely works. Telling a patient they are alive does not restore the missing emotional signal. The brain continues to receive sensory input without the accompanying sense of self, reinforcing the belief that something fundamental is absent. Without addressing the underlying neurological or emotional disruption, logic cannot break through the delusion. The link between walking corpse syndrome, depression, and brain damage reveals a haunting truth about human consciousness. Life is not maintained by organs alone, but by fragile networks of perception and emotion working in harmony. When those networks fracture, the mind can turn against the most basic certainty of all, leaving the individual trapped in a body that functions while the sense of being alive has already vanished. As walking corpse syndrome deepens, the belief of being dead can transform into something even more disturbing. For some sufferers, death is no longer seen as an end, but as a state they are permanently trapped within. This shift gives rise to the idea of cursed immortality, where the individual believes they have already died and are now unable to die again. Existence becomes an endless limbo stripped of meaning, relief, or escape. The thought of continuing forever in this state becomes more terrifying than death itself. In this mindset, the rules that govern ordinary human life no longer apply. If the person is already dead, then physical harm should have no consequence. Pain becomes irrelevant, injury meaningless, and danger powerless. This belief can lead individuals to place themselves in extreme situations, not out of thrill or recklessness, but out of certainty. They may step into traffic, fall from heights, or expose themselves to serious injury, convinced these actions will either prove their death or finally release them from their cursed state. What makes these behaviors especially alarming is the absence of fear. Fear depends on the instinct to preserve life, but when life is believed to be over, fear dissolves. The individual may approach dangerous acts with calm curiosity, treating them as experiments rather than threats. Survival does not reassure them. Instead, it reinforces the delusion. Each failed attempt to end their existence becomes evidence that they are beyond death, condemned to continue as something that should not exist. Self-harm in these cases is not driven by emotional pain in the traditional sense. It is often methodical and purposeful, aimed at confirming a belief rather than expressing distress. Some patients cut themselves to see if blood will flow, only to dismiss it as illusion or mechanical response. Others burn or injure their skin, convinced decay should not produce sensation. When pain occurs, it is reinterpreted as proof that nerves are malfunctioning rather than evidence of life. This belief can also lead to profound detachment from moral and social boundaries. If one believes they are no longer alive, responsibility loses meaning, consequences feel irrelevant. Relationships fade because connection requires mutual existence. Loved ones are seen as part of a world the patient no longer belongs to. Isolation deepens, not because the individual wishes to be alone, but because they believe they are fundamentally separate from the living. In some cases, the belief in immortality becomes paired with intense despair. The individual may feel trapped in a body that continues to function against their will, forcing them to endure a reality they believe should have ended. This state can be mentally unbearable, driving repeated attempts to escape through extreme actions. Each failure compounds the hopelessness, strengthening the conviction that release is impossible. Medical professionals find these cases among the most challenging to treat because traditional suicide prevention strategies often fail. The patient does not see themselves as alive and therefore does not see their actions as self-destructive. Interventions that rely on appeals to survival instinct or future hope collapse against a belief system that denies both. Treatment becomes a race against a mind that has rewritten reality itself. The curse of immortality within walking corpse syndrome reveals one of the darkest possibilities of the human psyche. When death is believed to have already occurred, life becomes a punishment rather than a gift, and existence stretches endlessly forward as something unnatural, unwanted, and impossible to escape. Despite being first identified over a century ago, walking corpse syndrome has not faded into medical history. Modern psychiatry continues to encounter cases that leave even experienced clinicians unsettled. These patients arrive in hospitals with clear speech, intact memory, and often normal intelligence, yet they insist with unwavering certainty that they are dead, empty, or no longer human. Advanced technology has not eliminated the syndrome, only revealed how complex and resistant it truly is. In one documented modern case, a middle-aged man was admitted after repeatedly telling his family that his brain had liquefied inside his skull. He claimed that his thoughts were no longer real and that what remained was a decaying mass. Medical scans showed no structural damage, severe enough to support his belief. Yet this evidence meant nothing to him. He demanded to be transferred to a morgue, insisting that a hospital was inappropriate for someone who had already died. Another case involved a woman who believed her blood had evaporated and her organs had ceased functioning. She described herself as hollow and weightless, convinced that any movement she made was an automatic response rather than an act of will. When doctors attempted to explain her test results, she dismissed them as fabricated or irrelevant. To her, machines were designed to measure life, and she no longer qualified as a living subject. These modern cases reveal how resistant the syndrome is to rational correction. Brain scans, blood tests, and physical examinations often fail to alter the belief. In some patients, imaging does reveal abnormalities in brain regions responsible for emotional processing and self-recognition. These findings support the idea that the syndrome arises from a disconnect between perception and emotional validation, where the brain recognizes the body but cannot emotionally confirm its existence. Treatment remains difficult and unpredictable. Antidepressants and antipsychotic medications can reduce symptoms in some cases, particularly when severe depression or psychosis is present. However, medication alone is often insufficient. In extreme and life-threatening situations, electroconvulsive therapy has been used with notable success, sometimes restoring emotional responsiveness and weakening the delusion. Despite its controversial reputation, This treatment has saved lives by breaking through mental states that resist all other intervention. Even when improvement occurs, recovery is often fragile. Patients may regain partial awareness of being alive while still feeling disconnected or unreal. Relapses are possible, especially under stress or depressive episodes. This instability underscores how deeply rooted the syndrome is within the brain's core mechanisms of identity and existence. What continues to disturb clinicians is not just the rarity of these cases, but their consistency across cultures and time periods. Despite differences in language, belief systems, and medical environments, the core delusion remains strikingly similar. People describe themselves as dead, empty, or non-existent using different words, yet the underlying conviction is the same. This suggests that walking corpse syndrome taps into a universal vulnerability in human consciousness. Modern medicine has mapped the brain with incredible precision, yet this condition remains a reminder of how much remains unknown. The syndrome resists simple explanation, defies logic, and challenges the assumption that awareness of life is automatic. Each case forces doctors to confront the unsettling reality that the sense of being alive is not guaranteed, but constructed, and that under certain conditions, the mind can dismantle it completely. Walking corpse syndrome ultimately forces a confrontation with the most unsettling question of all: what does it truly mean to be alive? The condition reveals that life is not defined solely by breath, heartbeat, or movement, but by a fragile internal agreement within the mind that existence is real. When that agreement fractures, the body may continue to function while the sense of being alive disappears entirely. This separation between biological life and conscious existence is what makes the syndrome so profoundly disturbing. The disorder exposes how identity is constructed moment by moment through emotional feedback, memory, and perception. Normally, every action is accompanied by a subtle confirmation of self, a feeling of presence that anchors the individual to reality. In walking corpse syndrome, this confirmation fails. The mind receives sensory information without the emotional resonance that gives it meaning. Sight, sound, and touch occur without ownership, creating the impression that the self has vanished. Without that internal witness, existence feels empty and artificial. This breakdown demonstrates that reality is not passively experienced, but actively maintained. The brain continuously interprets the world and assigns significance to it. When that process is disrupted, reality collapses inward. The individual does not lose intelligence or awareness, but loses belief in their own existence. This suggests that consciousness itself is not a fixed state, but a fragile balance, vulnerable to disruption by emotional trauma, neurological damage, or extreme psychological stress. Walking corpse syndrome also challenges the way society understands mental illness. It shows that suffering does not always manifest as visible pain or emotional turmoil. Some of the most dangerous states are quiet, logical, and emotionally numb. A person who calmly believes they are dead may not cry for help or display obvious distress, yet they are at immense risk. This highlights the importance of recognizing internal suffering, even when it lacks dramatic expression. The condition further reveals the limits of logic and reassurance. Evidence alone cannot restore a sense of existence once the emotional foundation has collapsed. This has profound implications for how mental health is treated. It suggests that healing requires more than correcting false beliefs. It requires rebuilding the emotional connection between the self and the body, restoring the feeling of presence that confirms life. Without this, facts remain hollow and unconvincing. On a deeper level, the syndrome acts as a mirror reflecting humanity's existential fears. Many people experience moments of emptiness, disconnection, or doubt about their place in the world. Walking corpse syndrome represents the extreme end of this spectrum, where doubt becomes certainty and emptiness becomes identity. It reveals how close the mind can come to erasing itself when overwhelmed by loss, trauma, or neurological disruption. The existence of this condition serves as a reminder that consciousness is not invincible. It is a delicate construct shaped by biology, emotion, and experience. When these elements fall out of balance, even the most fundamental truth can be undone. Walking corpse syndrome stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that the mind holds the power not only to shape reality, but to revoke it entirely, leaving behind a living body inhabited by the conviction that life has already ended.